Welcome to Conversations from the Edge of Consciousness. I'm your host, Christine Madera. For me, and possibly for you, the inner world of consciousness has always been much more real and way more fun than the so-called real material world. Growing up, I thought I was alone in this, but I'm not. There are a lot of us, and far too many have no one to talk to who shares this experience. I've been lucky to cultivate a community of friends who love to talk about the energies, ideas, and vibrations that are pushing the edges of our own consciousness, as well as our collective consciousness. In Conversations from the Edge, we share our conversations with you. Welcome to Conversations from the Edge. This is your host, Christine Madera, and we're back today with Amber Mehresh. Now, Amber has a fascinating story in that she is working interdimensionally with the love of her life, basically, or the love of her existence at this point, Nikola Tesla. And in our first conversation, she talked about how that relationship came to be. She met Nikola Tesla after a health crisis drove her into an extended sabbatical. And she really began to look for a deeper meaning and purpose in her life. And in that search, she found Nikola Tesla, not aware of who he was or the significance of him, but able to speak with him. And their relationship unfolded so that now they are working together interdimensionally through time and have this beautiful love story at the same time. So today we're going to explore a little bit more about that love connection, but a lot more about the time travel aspect. But first, I want to say welcome, Amber. It's great to talk with you again. You're always fascinating to talk with.
Oh, thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
So we talked about this a little bit before we got on the podcast, and you said that Nikola's purpose was to bring his inventions forward for the evolution of humanity, and the two of you were really working together for those kind of mutual ends. And you had agreed to meet and incarnate. Well, you had agreed to incarnate at separate times at the midpoints of each of your lives and meet up again in order to further this vision and this purpose. And so can you comment a little bit more about what that means? Because the two of you at the midpoints of your lives are not even in the same, you're not physically in the same reality at the same time. In fact, he died long before you were born. And so you were not anywhere close to having an overlap in this life. And yet you agreed to meet at these pivotal times for a purpose. So can you talk a little bit more about that and how that works?
Yes, as much as I myself understand, I'll talk. I'll talk
Okay.
about it. Uh, but yes, the choice to incarnate into separate timelines was deliberate. A part of it was to demonstrate the overcoming of the illusion of time, of separation through time. So part of it was that was to demonstrate how love can overcome, even seemingly impossible distances.
Yeah, time. Yes.
But also probably a larger part. That factors into my personal story with him.
hmm
But a large part of it is to unite the energy of our times.
hmm
Him back where he's now coming to me from 1899, and us here in 2021. The energy of these times have very different dynamics,
hmm
and by us being incarnated into these different times and then connecting to each other, we're pulling the energies of each of our times back and forth into each other. And so uh, I'm helping to anchor in the energy that I'm bringing from him when I go back to visit him and interact with him, uh, the energy of that time
hmm
into this current time here in 2021, and vice versa. He pulls the energy of our time here back into his time there. And so we're able to tap into very different energies. If you look at us in 2021, there's a ascension going on. There's a
hmm
lot going on in our current reality that he's tapping into that energy and pulling it back into his time and able to influence himself and his people and the people and his technology
Mm-hmm.
with the energy of ascension. And then whatever energy is going on back in his time, which is at the cusp of, worldwide inventiveness and exploration, and that energy is now getting into our time. And at some point, our timelines will merge one way or another, and we will all be on the highest timeline in which Nikola Tesla's technology was successful
Mm-hmm.
and in harmony with nature, and his dream of having it help the evolution of humanity is successful.
Well, I think that's going to be an amazing time when it finally unfolds. So, in order to do this work, you are really doing some interdimensional time travel and some time tinkering in a way. Now, that's some of the stuff that we've heard, like in that movie Back to the Future. They do this in Harry Potter. There's a lot of sci-fi stuff, and it's really about the danger of messing around in time. But as we said before, there really is no, like, when you step out of the material world, there is no time. And so it's not as hard and fast. Like, time is not as fixed or as hard and fast as we imagine it to be or as we experience it to be. It's much more malleable and much more changeable. And so as you're able to move back and forth and begin to shift and change things, like how you asked Nikola Tesla like why that was okay, because in our current our current existence we're taught that it's not okay. So what did he say about that?
Yes, I asked him, I'm like, is this really all right to tamper with our lives like this, with our timelines and world events? He's on a world
Hmm.
stage.
Yeah.
I'm like, is this really okay? And he said that it's a prerogative of ourselves as the higher self
Hmm.
aspect to go back to what could be viewed as our past selves or
Hmm.
less evolved selves, and give them guidance and help them with their life decisions. And that simply is like with every decision, every life decision that we make, we're stepping into a different timeline reality.
Hmm.
And that it's far more complicated than just one single version, one single timeline.
Yes.
There's multiple versions of me, multiple versions of possibilities
Hmm.
of myself, of Nicola, of the overlap between our lives. And so he says, from the viewpoint of where we are now, it's completely our prerogative to go and make changes or to influence the other versions of ourselves
Hmm.
into making changes.
Yeah, because there's that idea in physics that every time you come to kind of a significant binary choice, that there's a part of you that has taken one choice and a part of you that's taken the other choice, and your attention might be on one choice, but like you were saying before, your higher self might come back in our no time and prompt you and say, well, look how that choice turned out. What would happen if you took the other choice? And you can go back and live that other choice. And, it doesn't seem possible in our linear view of time. But kind of as I'm beginning to really understand time and everything happening at once, that really there's the only linearity in time is our perception of it. And that's actually a brain function. It's kind of a brain technology that puts everything into past and future, and then, of course, the present. But that outside of that, and even when that part of the brain is kind of tuned down, so when we're falling asleep, when we are in times where we're not quite so coherent, so like if you're in surgery and you come out of surgery and you're still in that fog, that time is much weirder and more malleable than we had experienced. And it's kind of getting that way anyway. So it's more believable in my view, or at least for me, that we actually can be very intentional with this in working with our higher self in shifting and changing versions of ourselves and time. So I'm excited to talk with you about this because the two of you are doing this quite intentionally. So how are you working together in order to merge these two timelines and accelerate or support the ascension process that we're in now?
Well, like I said, a lot of it is pulling each other's energy in, and
Mm-hmm.
that's having a influence on our collectives as well as our personal lives. And like I said, Nikola is such a um, he lived such an influential life,
Mm-hmm.
and with just a few tweaks, he's becoming even more influential.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so we're playing around with that. Like, what can we change that he has an even greater impact? And how can we bring this heart opening energy, this divine feminine energy of what's going on in my time of
Mm-hmm.
2021, back into his time when they were on the cusp of a lot of both societal and political issues around women and around inventions, around science. And so just making a few tweaks over the cascade of years and years, by the time his 1899 new timeline reality
Mm-hmm.
catches up to the new 2021 reality, just those few tweaks made that long ago is going to make a whole lot of difference and going to change the whole world in a it's like a catalyst. It just takes a small thing and then it just starts this whole chain reaction of other events that spiral out from there. And I say it as if it's happened because I have stepped into that
Mm-hmm.
future self in which it did happen,
Mm-hmm.
because really time doesn't exist, and so that
Right.
future aspect of ourselves and of our earth does exist on some in some dimensional reality, and you can go visit that if you know how. And so it exists already. And so it's just a matter of like, well, if that exists, how did we get from, you know, from here to there? And what do we need to make happen? And I'm the version of myself, and Nicola is the version of himself.
Mm-hmm.
That's in the process of making all that happen.
Okay. Well, and we have some experience of that, or at least some of it has been documented by what's called the Mandela effect, that there were significant numbers of people who had thought that Nelson Mandela had died in prison. And yet, and there's people who said that they've read the news stories, they've seen the articles and all of that. And I had a vague memory of that. And then, and then we were in a timeline where Nelson Mandela had not died in prison and that he was freed and he became the president of South Africa, which really set a whole different trajectory around human rights in the world. And I had vaguely remembered that as well, hearing that he had died in prison and then that he was going to be released. And I thought, huh. And there's a little bit of cognitive distance around that. But there's also then other smaller incidents like the Bernstein or Bernstein bears that, back in the day when that was really popular, it was one or the other. And then in current time, it's different. And there's, people who say, well, it's always been this way. And there's people who say, no, I remember specifically it was the other way. So it seems like we've had a little bit of experience of this already where we've had some shifts that have, that we've kind of absorbed, but still have a little vague memory of how things could have been or how things had been before we had made this switch. And so to me, that really speaks of not just our personal way of shifting time, but our collective way of viewing ourselves and shifting where we are as a trajectory of humanity. And so it seems like to me that these changes, as they're being catalyzed, may they may just maybe small changes in perception through the decades of when Tesla was working in the late 1800s to now, which is not, what is it? It's 120 years or so. And so it's not that long of a period of time. And yet you're right, those little incremental changes can have these subtle effects through the energy of time so that we're perceiving things much differently than we had before. Does that kind of sound like what the two of you were doing in a way?
Yes, and he's told me, he's like, the lifetime that you know in your history as Nikola Tesla,
Mm-hmm.
that's not my final draft.
Oh,
That's not the final draft of my life. Um,
wow.
and so yeah, it's as easy as that. It's like changing the story,
Mm-hmm.
changing the perspective. When you change your perspective of what's possible,
Mm-hmm.
back then when I step into his time to help him make those changes, a big part of that is sharing a different perspective, a different possibility. Like,
Mm-hmm.
Nicola, you could do this a little differently, um, than this, and it might have a different effect. And so when you change your perspective, it changes the way you see the world. It changes everything. And when somebody's vision is changed and they're seeing the world in a different perspective, um,
Mm-hmm.
what that is you've just stepped into a different reality. And it's not like you have to get into this big complicated time machine with all these
Mm-hmm.
buttons and levers and whirling lights, and then you're in a different time. No, it's simply that you've shifted your perspective in such a
Mm-hmm.
way that you see things differently, and now you're making decisions differently, and now you're living your life in a different way. And yeah, and then so we did that with deliberate effort back in Nicola's timeline reality.
Mm-hmm.
But then now, with his shift in perspective, now he's able to also go back further into the past, what you would call the past,
Mm-hmm.
into into his previous um, lifetime, and
Mm-hmm.
make changes, and then into other lifetimes. And eventually you get to the point where you're the higher views, the higher perspective
Mm-hmm.
of yourself, the highest version of yourself is informing the other versions of yourself that, hey, you might want to make this change. And so we're shifting everything onto its higher timeline, not just from Nicola's time, but even back to what you would call the beginning of time.
Mm-hmm.
So we're all, shifting into that highest timeline perspective because it exists, it's there.
Mm-hmm.
You just need
Yeah.
to shift your perspective there. And so the lower possibilities also exist. They're there. They
Yeah.
all exist together. They all exist in the mind of God. But what matters is, where are you putting your perspective? What part, which stories are you choosing to animate?
Mm-hmm. I think with this whole idea, it really helps us to become less attached to the current version of the story that we live and the current version of the reality that we have. Now, for some people, that might help them to make changes more easily. And for others, it might be helpful. I've done this to go back into my past and kind of tweak some of the energies in my past to change my present and to allow myself to change more easily in the present. But this whole idea of being able to pay attention to different aspects of who you are in time seems to be, to me, make a lot of sense in one way if you step out of the linear aspect of it, because if everything already exists and you can shift your perspective to a whole different perspective, and life will then incrementally begin to move toward that perspective, it gives that sense of multidimensionality in our current life, and even as our human existence now, that you and Nicola are operating within. because you're working with these different dimensions, with these different times, and making these adjustments that are available, I think, for everybody. But how has it changed your perspective of what's possible by playing with these interdimensional shifts?
It has changed my perspective completely. In fact, it's changed my very perspective of who I am and my
Mm-hmm.
identity. Because when you discover who you truly are as God, as Source, is when you start to play in these dimensions and say, "Oh, I am not just this particular lifetime. I am not this particular body, this particular incarnation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so much more." Uh, it gives a different perspective, yes. But one thing that if you are so tied down to the stories of
Mm-hmm.
your lifetime, of your personal struggles, be it, abuse, personal traumas,
Mm-hmm.
family stories, whatever your story might be, if that's where you're gaining your identity, if
Mm-hmm.
that's who you think you are solely based on that,
Mm-hmm.
then yeah, you're going to have a really hard time shifting into something else, uh,
Yes.
and being malleable, and jumping into different time dimensions because it Mhm. There's a perspective of who you are that's not attached to those stories.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're too attached to those stories, you're attaching yourself to that one particular timeline. And that timeline maybe led to a lot of struggles, which, in Nicola's timeline, certain traumatic events of his in his lifetime led to other struggles,
Mm-hmm.
and a lifetime of where he at different points in his life dealt with poverty and infamy and being called a mad scientist and all those other
Mm-hmm.
struggles that he dealt with, which were the culmination of the previous events that led to them. And so if he was super attached to those events that had led to all that, he would have just continued in that loop
Mm-hmm.
of being stuck in those same events and not being able to get out of that. But once you're able to detach from identifying yourself as those stories and let go of what you think your past is, then really you can choose your own past. You can choose what energy you bring into your past and then shift what energy your future is going towards. And what matters most is your present moment, because your present moment is the steering wheel which guides all of that. And this is the launching pad which guides all of that. So it's kind of funny, but yeah, you can change your past.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
and you
Yes.
can change your future.
Mm-hmm.
And it's simply what you decide in this present moment you want it to be.
Yeah, and the more I lean into it, the more I kind of come to that realization. And I had heard a speaker say, this was somebody who was channeling, I believe, and had asked the channeled being, what do you see when you see us, like as us as individual humans? And the being said, well, we don't see you as an individual human. We see all of you, everything in play all at the same time. And then we see the one little part of you that's expressing itself right now as the human that you are in this moment. But what we see when we look at you is everything. And we see the human in the context of everything. And that's a really big concept, but it was really quite helpful for me. But you can actually think about that in your life as well, that there's the present moment now, but it's within the context of all this possibility, possible past, possible futures, possible other alternate present moments. And that if all of those are in play, it seems much, and all of those are you, are just different expressions of you, that the ability to then be able to shift your focus to a different aspect seems so much easier than trying to force or make your current timeline into something that maybe it's not really on gear or on track to do. And it really, I mean, it opens up the possibilities. The possibilities are endless. But I want to get back for a moment to time travel, because that's what we
Sure,
were sort
sure.
of talking about. And when you time travel, you do it through meditation, right? And through shamanic journeys, through various things like that. So for you, what is it like when you step into a different time?
Yes, and I have tools that I use. I have some crystals
Mm-hmm.
and, um, you know, smoke clearing the area if I feel it's necessary.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, you have your tools to help you go into that space of meditation. But for me, well, I guess for anybody, the most important aspect of how to time travel
Mm-hmm.
is your intention of where you're placing your focus.
Mm-hmm.
And when you shift your focus, consciousness, your conscious awareness to that moment of where you've shifted your focus to that moment or that place or that person, whatever you're shifting your focus to,
Mm-hmm.
and then you pull more and more of your consciousness into that. You feel into it. Okay, if I'm in this moment, you know, what does it feel like? What am I smelling? What
Mm-hmm.
are the textures? What's the visual information that's coming through? Is anybody speaking? What's the auditory sound like? And so you pull in all the senses and you
Mm-hmm.
start to piece it together. And the more you steep yourself into that uh, shifted awareness, the more real it becomes. And the
Mm-hmm.
more you're able to see, the more you're able to feel, the more you're able to experience it. Almost to the point where I lose my awareness of, okay, I'm laying here on this bed meditating,
Mm-hmm.
and I've stepped into the awareness of, oh, okay, I'm back here interacting with Nicola and we're having this grand conversation.
Okay, so can you give an example of when you go back and you're doing some things, making these little tweaks that begin to shift time? Like, how do you do that? What's that process like?
Uh, the most important for me is
Mm-hmm.
the heart energy, is the emotion of it. If you can feel into the emotion of
Mm-hmm.
something, like, the color yellow is not just what you see, but it's what you feel. You feel the energy and the excitement of that color and
Mm-hmm.
the vibrance of it. So a lot of this is heart based
Mm-hmm.
and feeling, not just like trying to keep things on a physical mind level,
Mm-hmm.
um, but shifting your heart energy. And then once you're able to feel into the emotions of a place or of a person,
Mm-hmm.
then you're like really in it. You get excited. Like when I go back and visit Nicola, I the moments that I choose are things that I find intriguing or exciting. And I did that, when I was first starting to do that, I did it without really, you know, without the deliberateness.
Mm-hmm.
But now I realize it is that excitement, it is that enthusiasm for wanting to be in that moment that is fueling my ability to be in that moment.
Mm-hmm. So you get into a moment and you're with Nicola. And can you give an example of something that you did that tweaked some energy that began to shift things to a different timeline?
Yes, I can. Okay, this is a small example that I'll
Okay,
use,
that's perfect.
which was just kind of for fun that I went back. I
Mm-hmm.
was really curious to watch him interact with his friends,
Mm-hmm.
because up to that particular point, I had always gone and he was alone. And it was
Mm-hmm.
just me and him talking and interacting. So I was really curious what he was like hanging out with his friends. So I tell my crystals, I'm like, okay, take me to where he's hanging out with company with his friends. I want to see what his interaction is like when he's just relaxing and hanging out with loved ones and people he cares about. So I go back and I leave it a little open ended. I didn't have a particular event in mind. I'm like, just anything that's involving him with his people.
Mm-hmm.
So I go back, and my crystals and my dragon and all my tools that I use to do these journeys, I get dropped off in this hotel.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not the usual hallway which leads to his room. I'm like, okay, this is different. It's leading to a different room. I can sense it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of feel my way through a doorway, and I open the doors, and I believe it was a players club,
Mm-hmm.
because all these guys were like hanging around, and they were sitting around these round tables,
Mm-hmm.
and they were like all gambling with their cards, and several of them are smoking their cigars, and they've got their whiskey glasses and whatnot by them. I'm like, oh, this is so exciting. So I was absolutely thrilled. And I spot Nikola right away.
Mm-hmm.
He happened to be sitting in a position where he was almost kind of facing the doorway where I entered.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought to myself, oh, this is so exciting. I'll just kind of hide behind this other guy, and I'll just watch.
Uh-huh.
And he won't know that I'm here. So I thought that, okay, well, if I don't call attention to myself, he's not going to see
Uh-huh.
me. I was mistaken. Almost immediately, like, his eyebrows shoot up, and he gets this expression on his face where it's just completely clear that he saw me.
Uh-huh.
And so he's like with his friends, and so he does this thing where he's like, he's surprised to see me, but then he's like, got to act like he's, normal.
Yeah.
And so he's kind of giving me side glances
Mm-hmm.
over to where I'm trying to hide behind this guy. And so I'm like, oh, I'm like, okay, well, he sees me. Forget it. I'll just fine. So I go back up. So I go up behind him, and I'm like, oh, I'm so happy to see him. So I bend over, and like, I kiss the back of his neck. Like, I don't know what got into me. I'm like, oh, I was just like happy to see me. I had to give my little interaction.
Uh-huh.
And whatever, if he had not been deciding to leave his little get together in that moment, he must have decided, because he puts his hands down, he puts his cards down, and announces to his table mates, oh, I gotta go. And they're like, what, you just got here? You're like, what, it's not even late. Why are you leaving? And he's like, no, I something came up, I gotta go. And so he excuses himself,
Uh-huh.
and he doesn't say anything to me. What was he can't yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I just follow him out the room, and he goes to this little, like, where he picks up his hat and coat,
Mm-hmm.
hat check place, I
Uh-huh.
guess, from in the hotel. And I'm like, this is so exciting. I'm like, wow. I'm like, I feel like I'm right back here in, like, whatever, late 1800s.
Uh-huh.
And I'm getting to see the hotel in a way that I never really got to see it. And so I follow him out, and I'm chattering like the whole time. I'm like, this is so exciting, Nicholas. I'm like, but you didn't have to leave. You don't have to leave. I wanted to see you with your friends. Why are you leaving? So I'm like just chattering like that the whole time. And he's
Uh-huh.
being silent and just giving like a little small smile, because
Uh-huh.
there's still people around. And so he walks out the doors of the hotel, and I'm following him. And he gets in a car. And now this is like 1894, which I didn't know until we got back to his room. And I asked him, I'm like, what year is it? He's like,
Uh-huh.
1894. And so, like, after my meditation, I had to Google, I'm like, did they even have cars in 1894? Because
Uh-huh.
I'm like, wow. And so we get in the car, and we go back to his own hotel, and
Uh-huh.
which was very short drive. So it must not have been too far. And then as soon as he opens the door to his hotel room, he's like, who are you? why are you visiting me? And he's asking me like this barrage of questions.
Uh-huh.
So by this point, I had visited him like a couple times in the past,
Uh-huh.
as I said in my last episode, but he
Mm-hmm.
didn't know who I was. And I was not completely coherent enough to have introduced myself properly. And so by this point, he's like, who are you? Why are you visiting me? What's going on here? And
Uh-huh.
so I didn't come with a script. I wasn't expecting his questions.
Uh-huh.
So I stumbled my way through that interaction.
Uh-huh.
And by the end of which, I come back out of meditation and I'm like just shaking my head. I'm like, oh, I totally botched that again.
Uh-huh.
And it was a fun conversation nonetheless,
Okay.
even though I feel like, okay, I totally botched it. Why do I keep
Uh-huh.
going back in time and like completely botching it with him and
Mm-hmm.
having these what must seem like utterly confusing conversations with him?
Yeah.
And I didn't explain myself very well, and I could have said this and I could have done that, and I wasn't planning to have a whole conversation. I was just going to go back and watch him with his
Mm-hmm.
friends. So like I came out of that meditation like kind of beating myself up a little bit and saying, oh,
Mm-hmm.
I just botched that so badly. And the version of him that was actually with me, in my day-to-day life is
Uh-huh.
just laughing. And he's laughing. And I'm like, oh, why are you laughing? And he's like, you have no idea how fun that was to see the other side of that little conversation because he had lived it already,
Uh-huh.
you know and now he was like, in his perspective, he was going back to it years later and
Uh-huh.
now seeing it from my perspective of going
Oh.
back to talk with him. So so that like had me scratching my head. I'm like, oh, this but he's like, this is so much fun. He's like, this is just he's like, I can't believe how much fun this is.
Mm.
And that's kind of been what it is for us. We're just really having fun exploring, just those little dynamics of what it's like to be able to go visit each other before we know each other, before we know who we are. And then like from his perspective, years later, revisiting that and saying, oh wow, that's what that visit was about.
So when you talked before about like you're pulling his energy into our time and he's pulling your energy into his time, like what do you mean by that? Is it your personal energy or is it the energy of the times that we're in? Or what is that? Can you flesh that out just a little bit?
It is a little bit of both. In fact, I don't think that I could even really completely separate my
Mhm.
physical self from the energy that I exist in this collective.
Mhm.
So it's a little bit of both. But as I'm opening up my heart and opening up myself to these possibilities, the energy of what is possible as his other soul half,
Mhm.
as his twin soul, that's also opening up possibilities within him.
Mhm.
So, by each of us, by exploring other possibilities of our own timelines and of our lives and of our interactions with each other, we are. And it's such a dynamic thing. It's not at all static the way that, when I try to describe it in words, it sounds a little bit more static. But it's a very dynamic thing. Like one shift in me shifts
Mhm.
his perspective too. And my heart opening up, influences him to open up him and explore himself from a different perspective, even deeper. My questioning him about certain things that he does and certain perspectives that he has makes him question those perspectives and opens him up to other ones. And on a whole collective level, when we have these kind of conversations that I'm having with you,
Mhm.
I think it opens up other people's hearts and opens up their minds and their awareness of the possibilities. And they, what are, they're like, well, what is this that's going on? This ascension, this timeline
Mhm.
shift, this, what are they talking about? So their consciousness starts to question, okay, what is really going on here? Everything, maybe they'll have these conversations with themselves that, okay, maybe my view of reality isn't as set in stone as I thought it was. And so now they start to shift their life,
Mhm.
and everybody, we collectively work together. And Nikola in his time was at a time, is poised at a time in 1899 where he's now coming from, um, before a lot of what we would see as like the darker themes that
Mhm.
we've explored of world wars, of
Power, money,
power, of the
business.
Federal Reserve System, the money, the debt system, the medical control, and other
Mhm.
controls in which you would view them as a form of enslavement,
Yeah.
enslaving us to a certain financial systems, which we become debt slaves,
Yeah.
or
Or power
slaves to,
structures.
yes, power structures, or to the energy, to the actual like power grid, in
Mhm.
which we have wires strung all over the place, in what could otherwise be a beautiful view. Now
Mhm.
we're looking at these ugly wires, and even if you're not thinking about it on a conscious level, that's in your vision
Mhm.
as part of your view. The, oh yeah, energy is only sent over power, over over these wires, and this is how it is, and we're stuck in this, and the only way to get out of this is to create these other contraptions, these other possibility,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
we're kind of spiral deeper into this sort of technological trap and other enslavement traps. Whereas in Nicola's time, we have not dug ourselves in like that
Mhm.
yet. The world is fresh. Um, Invention is at its peak
Mhm.
of the individual inventors and exploring their possibilities. We have Nikola Tesla, of course. We have Rontgen and his
Mhm.
X-rays. We have um, Edison.
Yeah.
I'm
Edison.
sure. Yes, and we have, the Madame Curie.
Madame Curie.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, Ford. We have a lot going on
Uh huh.
at the turn of the century
Mhm.
that has not yet culminated in the power structures
Yeah.
that we've become familiar with here.
Yeah.
So it's a prime opportunity for him to pull a different kind of heart energy
Mhm.
into that reality, and help people shift the direction that it could go.
Well, and I like the way that you're talking about this because oftentimes, in our current mythology of time and time travel, it's really people travel in time either to change a specific outcome, to push Lincoln out of the way so he doesn't get killed, or, to in some movies, to save the world blowing up and that kind of stuff. So it's for a particular outcome. But what you're talking about and how I've experienced kind of going back in time and making shifts is that it's not about changing an outcome. It's about operating from a different perspective, as you say, and also the energy of in that moment making fresh choices that move you in a different direction versus saying, well, in 20 years, what can I do now so that in 20 years I have this outcome, which is not, the way that we really operate. But
Yes,
instead to come back and say,
yes,
okay, so if I was more infused with heart energy, if I was able to maintain, relationships in business versus being in this competitive atmosphere that got his laboratory burned down, that
yes,
how would that
yes,
simple change be able to change everything? And the same thing with all of our power structures. If we had been or go back in time and begin to make some of those shifts about being heart centered with whoever our family was at that time, particularly if they were, you know, in some of these things, where it was a more opening toward what's good for my benefit and the benefit of everybody versus what's good for my benefit, and how can I, you know, make everybody else work for my benefit, which was kind of how it ended up being. Like, what would those little choices make?
Yeah, in fact, you bring a really good point. Even okay, we talked last time about the fire
Mm-hmm.
that was an event that we had altered. But the main point of me traveling back before that fire happened and getting him to alter that was not just about altering the fire. The point of that series of conversations that I had with him
Mm-hmm.
was, in fact, to connect him with his higher self, to
Mm-hmm.
connect him with his heart energy, and thereby not just the fire, but even other decisions he was able to alter. So it wasn't about, oh, we're going to stop the fire.
Yeah.
No, our focus was on how can we help him open up to his higher possibility, his higher self, to his heart energy,
Mm-hmm.
and expand his consciousness in a more catalytic way
Yeah.
than that other timeline in which he was less successful.
And as a result of that, he made a series of decisions that led to that fire not happening.
Yes,
And
correct.
so, like, that's the exciting thing about time travel, that it's not, or as you're doing it, time shifting and interdimensional time shifting, that it's not about scripting a particular outcome. It's about changing the trajectory of possibility. And that's what's exciting to me about it. But I also wanted to ask you, because you tend to go, or you do go into meditation, you have your tools, you time travel and interdimensional travel that way. But Nikola Tesla is Nikola Tesla, and he doesn't have to travel that way. So can you talk a little bit about how he does it?
Yeah, it is different. And I've tried in my channeling and stuff to pick his brains on giving me this device.
I think
And
we just make it dangerous in
yeah,
our day and age. Yeah,
yeah, he has not yet.
probably wise.
But he says someday I'll have access to that, but not yet. He says just stick with your meditations for now.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, what happened is when he was back in Colorado, his series of Colorado experiments,
Mm-hmm.
he stepped in, somehow created a field of energy in which he sort of saw time collapse in on itself.
Mm-hmm.
He stepped into a space in which time did not exist.
Mm-hmm.
He could see past, present, and future as if it was all in one moment.
Mm-hmm.
And he sort of tucked that away into his brain, but it wasn't the focus of his particular experiments. And so he didn't follow it up
Mm-hmm.
until years later when his pigeon died.
Mm-hmm.
And then I came back to him after his pigeon died and he was in grief.
Mm-hmm.
I came back to him as myself and I said, Nicola, um, you need to come find me. And he says, well, I've been looking for you all over in the parks, I'm like, well, I'm not a pigeon anymore.
Oh my gosh.
and and I'm like, well, I'm not a pigeon anymore. I'm
Uh-huh.
living this whole other life as my human self, and I need your help.
Mm-hmm.
In my timeline, I'm really struggling in 2019. I really need you.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's like, well, I, he's like, I don't know how to get to you. And so I reminded him, I'm like, well, you had these experiments that you did back in Colorado in which you were set free from the
Mm-hmm.
illusion of time. You can recreate that energy field, and that's what you're using in order to come visit me. is you create this is so strange. So I had stepped back into a slightly past version of the self that was now visiting me.
Uh-huh.
And so now I was instructing him how he made it possible that he comes to visit me.
Oh my gosh.
So what he does is he has this sort of device. And when I stepped back for the first time into where he was actually projecting himself from,
Mm-hmm.
in his physical reality,
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of surprised by what I saw. Is I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe I thought that he was meditating in the same way that I was.
Mm-hmm.
But when I stepped back into that moment with him, first of all, it was very confusing because the moment that I stepped into that space, I felt myself pulled into all kinds of other dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
And it was extremely challenging for me to regain my focus enough to focus back on him in the moment that I was
Mm-hmm.
trying to grasp him. And I was finally able to refocus back on him alone and see the setting in which he was there. And he was there sitting in a chair
Mm-hmm.
and in what was his laboratory space. And around him, he had sort of these conical shaped, like if you look at his pictures of his Colorado experiments, you can get an idea of what this was. It was like a conical shape with wire wrapped around it.
Mm-hmm.
And he had like, I don't know, like 5 or 6 of these little tower things
Uh-huh.
surrounding where he was sitting. And so he was creating this field of energy in which he was sitting in order to time travel.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I sort of helped instruct. So I described that to him. I'm like, this
Oh
is
my
what you're
gosh.
doing.
Uh-huh.
And you're creating this field of energy in order to, leap time and come visit me. And so then I step up like a few months in his
Uh-huh.
time in which he had not yet succeeded.
Mm-hmm.
He was still struggling, and I again visited him in his lab, and he was like near tears, and he was like, I can't do it, I can't figure it out. I have this field of energy and I can see that it's like time collapsed. It's past, present, future. I can see all
Mm-hmm.
the time, but I still don't know how to get to you. I don't know how to find you. And so like and he's still in his grief, and he's
Mm-hmm.
like, and so he's like almost in tears, in a sort of desperate grief state. He's like, I don't know how to find you. I don't I don't know where you are in this. And so then I described to him.
Uh-huh.
It was like, well, this is what I'm doing. So maybe that will help you. So I'm just focusing in on one singular moment
Mm-hmm.
and tuning the rest out. And I'm bringing myself into this moment. And I just like what I told you,
Uh-huh.
which is what I do. I feel into it as if I can see the colors, as if I can feel the textures, as if I can taste the tastes and smell what it, and I described that. I'm like, this is what I'm doing when I do this, when we're traveling to each other. And so like I'm instructing him.
Oh my gosh.
but which was just like kind of like again like a big head scratcher. Of course he succeeded.
Mm-hmm.
And so by the time that he succeeded in developing his time technology, it was about 1923
Mm-hmm.
in which he first started coming to me. So he was coming to me as his 1923 and then 1924 and then 1925 version of himself
Mm-hmm.
uh, prior. And so it was his 1925 version of himself that instigated the conversations of going back to his 1894 version of himself and saying, hey, you need to make some changes. You need to talk to me.
Uh-huh.
And so then when he did, he connected with his future self.
Wow.
And then his future self taught him about his time technology. And so now his younger self, he's now coming to me as his 1899
Oh
human
my God.
self, has his time technology, which he uses to travel the dimensions and, of course, visit me and basically explore all the, explore actually the timeline of where everything went awry, as well
Mhm.
as other timeline possibilities for himself. And really anything which he wants to explore, he can step into that field of energy and go
Mhm.
explore it. And so he uses that in order to explore the dimensions.
Wow, that is so cool. Thank you for explaining that and for
I hope it made some sense.
it. Well, I gotta say, it makes sense to me. I've had a lot of head injuries, so maybe that's why it makes sense to me. And I've also just, I've had this really interesting experience that it's almost an either or in some ways, that you can either be really focused on the physical world and everything that's happening in it as reality, or you can be in this alternate space where there's like all kinds of things are part of the larger experience of truth and reality, but it's hard to bridge the gap between the two. And so
Hmm.
part of what I'm doing with this podcast and what is what I kind of did is I sort of surrendered to the idea that everything that I thought the way things worked isn't actually the way they work, except at this very surface level. And if you follow those energies, like, life hurts. And I just got tired of life hurting. And when you open to everything else that's possible, like, things like that completely make sense to me, but I could never explain that to my old self that was really looking at the surface of life and thinking that that was reality. So, but once you just decide to drink the Kool-Aid and let go of
Yes.
the surface life as reality, and all, for me, the pain that has to do with this, the brutalness that we have with one another, it's just so much more relaxing and fun, and to explore the possibilities of how different people experience the reality that we're in without getting tied to, what is reality, because, like, once you get a
Yes.
fixed idea of what that is, then it's no longer fun. Like, then you're in that fixed position. So
Yeah, and it's truly like we don't actually live in a culture of enslavement and power tripping. It really is all illusion. And when you
mhm,
can escape from that perspective of
yeah.
I'm trapped in this situation, which is what your ego is telling you, because
Yeah.
function in this physical life, we came in with our ego, we came in with our believing in the illusions,
Hmm.
believing that we're these only this physical being. And so to play the game of life, there was certain ground rules that we agreed to coming
Hmm.
into it. But yeah, now we can take control of the game ourselves and say, oh, you know what, I don't want to play it that way anymore.
Yeah.
I'm bored of that. I want to
Oh,
do something
yes.
different. And
Yeah.
yeah, anything is possible when you finally open up to the possibilities.
Yes, and I'll explain it one other way, and then we can get off. But for people who, I've been writing about this, that when we're trapped in that the surface level, where we need to conform to how we believe reality is, and that's the trap, that you're always like that what you perceive reality to be is fixed, and that you have to adapt yourself to this fixed version, these fixed systems that really aren't set up for your highest good or well-being. They're really set up for their own perpetuation, and you got to figure out how to fit in there. You got to struggle to be successful. You got to struggle to survive, because you've got to adapt to all of your beliefs about what these ideas and these systems and this reality is. But when you let go of that and you move into the space that you're in, and that you're working with Nikola Tesla in, where you are this beautiful, expansive, universal being that is inherently existing and true, and that all of reality is a playground that you get to experience, but none of it has any control over you anymore. Like, that's the place of freedom. And it's magnificent to begin to play in that sphere and recognize that life is so much different than what we've been taught to believe that it is. And everything can be so much more fun and playful, and interesting and expansive and experimental. than we normally have been taught to experience the world.
Yes, it's so much more fun than
Oh,
just,
goodness.
yeah,
Yeah.
than
All
just the
right.
slog workaday world.
Well, and if you've been listening to this and you're wanting more, and you want to actually interact and play with us, I'm starting to be on Clubhouse, where we can interact with you and bring my guests on Clubhouse, and we can have different kinds of conversations, and you can tell us what you think. So if you have found this interesting and you've got your 2 cents, or you want to dive deeper or listen to more conversations with us, come on to my Clubhouse, take a look at the events, and then you can find times to talk with me and Amber and me and the other guests, and it should be a lot of fun. So I'm just getting started with that. I will have links on conversationsfromtheedge.net so you can find these things. And I also have links for Amber on Conversations from the Edge and her YouTube channel and her email. But can you tell people a little bit about your YouTube, and then we will wrap up?
Yes, I've recently started a YouTube channel, which is my channel is me exploring my awakening journey,
Mm-hmm.
and which, of course, my relationship with Nikola is a large factor in that. So there
Yeah.
is a lot of Nikola Tesla in my story,
Uh-huh.
but it's at the heart of it. It's my own awakening story, which I'm hoping to as sort of a almost like a video journal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I hope others join me there, and you can. Some of the stories which I shared here, I'll go into a little bit more detail
Mm-hmm.
as I go along on
Okay,
my
we'll have that
channel.
link. But what's it called?
Journey of the Dove
Journey of the
is
Dove.
is my YouTube channel,
All right,
and my
perfect.
email is journeyofthedove@gmail.com.
Excellent. All right, well, Amber, it's as always just so much fun talking with you. I can't wait for our next conversation and see what comes up with that.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
This is your host, Christine Madera. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation from the edge of consciousness. You can find all our conversations at conversationsfromtheedge.net. You'll also find links to schedule a private conversation with me or any of my friends, as well as tools to help you expand your own consciousness and explore what's possible for you outside the boundaries of your current perceptions. Feel free to use this podcast to start your own conversation by sharing it with friends, on social media, in your blog, or even in your own podcast. And as always, live the adventure of pushing your own edge. It's the most amazing adventure there is.